Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor for me to introduce Alan for this special talk. And as you know, the topic that he's going to speak about today is a little personal, and I've wanted to give a little bit more of a personal introduction to Alan than might be appropriate for a regular research seminar. So hopefully you'll learn some things that you didn't quite know. So Alan grew up in the 60s and 70s in suburban New Haven. His father was a dentist. He has two younger twin sisters, and his mother worked at Yale. And this might have been Alan's first exposure to intense scientific research, in that his mother was in the International Scholars Office and responsible for getting papers and green cards for the researchers and professors at Yale. And I know there are many very, very thankful people faculty from Yale that are still nice to Alan today because his mom got him a green card. So this is probably like a nice place to have your youth and grow up. Although I know it has been responsible for one serious problem that has plagued him through his life, including today. You probably know that Connecticut is a very divided state. There's about one half of the state are Red Sox fans, and one half of the state are Yankees fans. And Alan, unfortunately, grew up in Yankee country. And he remains a Yankee fan today. And this is a source of, serious tension with the 5th and 6th floor scientists, and also with his wife and his son. His son has even, at times, thrown him under the bus, so to say, as yelling out, "Hey guys, he's a Yankee fan," in some dangerous situations. So he's scarred from his childhood. He went to college at Yale, where his interests were Brown, excuse me. No, he wouldn't go to Yale. Brown doesn't have a required curriculum, which was important in Alan's choice of a college, because he didn't want to be told what to do. So he went, had a very successful college education at Brown, where his interests were in biological science and in research and music, and he played flute for one of the university bands. In the early 80s, he started his PhD in molecular biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he worked on the regulation of transcription, first with Professor Dick Burgess, and then with Professor Carol Gross. That is where he met me, because I was an undergraduate in the same labs. So I think we met in 1981, which is a long time ago. He was a very intense student. He worked hard, thought deeply about his work, and was very opinionated about things that he read or heard in seminars, or learned about through different scientific interactions. He became very sought after by other students and postdocs and even faculty for help in designing and interpreting experiments, opinions about their projects, editing their manuscripts, listening to their practice talks, and most people approached him really wanting help, but also with significant level of fear, because he could be brutally honest about what he thinks. You may think this side of Alan's remains today, but there's really no comparison. He was much more scary there. Although a source of fear, he was also a very loyal member to the lab group, always looking out for his other members of the lab and his friends. That continues today. I think he's still friendly with everyone that was in the lab at that time, including both of his old advisors and all the former grad students and some of the former undergrads. Like myself. For instance, he's hosting people that are going to the bacterial stress Gordon conference this coming weekend. So after finishing a successful PhD work, including discovery of the first alternative sigma factor in E. coli, that was responsible for transcribing the heat shock response genes. He wanted to work in bacterial development, so he came to Rich Lozik's lab, which is one of the leading labs in the world on that subject. There he discovered a bacterial pheromone, which is involved in cell-cell communication, and this was really in the early days of thinking about bacteria living as communities at all. So that was very important. Since then, that work he then continued when he came here to MIT, and he has made very important scientific contributions to bacterial physiology, molecular biology, evolution, regulation, control of DNA replication in the cell cycle, and was really one of the first groups in the prokaryotic world to be using computational biology and true cell biology techniques as part of his research. He's well decorated as a scientist. He's a fellow of the American Society of Microbiology, the AAAS, and the National Academy of Science. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is a great member of the department. Some of his favorite things to do are mentoring students, where he is less scary than he was, and mentoring young faculty members. He still listens to lots of practice talks and reads lots of other people's grants and manuscripts. He's dedicated to the department, and he's served for many, many years as head of the graduate committee. He's been extremely involved in every year in the application process and admission process. He's been associate head of the department, and as you know, he's now department head. Poor guy. I just wanted to share a couple memories of Alan's illness from my point of view. I remember the day that he walked in from the parking garage into the lab. The parking garage was here, and into the lab over in 68. He said, "You know, I'm really out of breath. What's going on with this? It doesn't feel like my normal asthma." And so then he went over to MIT Medical, and I think they took him directly to MGH to see what was wrong. He then got a pacemaker that was supposed to take care of it, and it turned out, as you'll hear, that he had an extremely rare type of heart disease. He was relatively lucky in considering the depth of the seriousness of his disease and the rarity of it, that he was able to stay at home rather than being hospitalized for all the years that he was waiting for a new heart. Some of those years he was able to live at home on medication, and he had thesis committee meetings there. He's always really enjoyed cooking and eating, and he would make fabulous healthy meals and invite us over for lunch or dinner regularly to keep in touch with the people at MIT. He eventually did get a heart, and the lab, his friends, his family were all elated. I remember when his wife Marcia called me and said that the operation had been a success, and could I please stop by and pick up a HEPA filter system and turn it on to put it in his office? It turned out that Alan didn't need the HEPA filter yet. It took a while to recover from that operation, and I remember just like everybody, this sort of dramatic situation of everybody being so elated that this has finally happened and he'd gotten a new heart. Yet he was in great pain at that time because they wouldn't give him painkillers or anything. They didn't want to mess with his physiology. And so that was just like really one of those moments of you could just see this tension between euphoria and this sucks. Finally, it was really amusing when Alan came back to the lab because he had missed like 4 years or so of seminars and techniques and stuff. So I'd go sit with him at the colloquium and he'd say, "What are they talking about?" to certain things. It was really like an interesting way of seeing how fast things happen in science, and it was a nice snapshot into what had happened over the last few years. So Alan is now, seems to be a very healthy person. He'll tell you more about that. I'm actually, he is so healthy that I feel the right to be annoyed at him, that he can play tennis twice a week and be on the softball team and get regular exercise, which is still like a struggle for me. So you know he's pretty healthy if I'm not like saying, oh yay, Alan's getting exercise. I'm like, oh man. So I think we forget how ill he really was and how incredibly fortunate we, as his friends and his scientific colleagues, are to have him here today to drive us crazy.
I should probably stop there. Thank you, Tanya. Almost everything she said is true. Certainly the stuff about my background in grad school is all true. The exercise part is a stretch. So Mandana has been asking me to do this for several years, and I've said no, and if any of you know Mandana, she sometimes can be a little bit persistent. So finally I said yes, and part of the reason I said yes was this year is actually the 10th anniversary of my heart transplant. So May was my 10-year anniversary, which is kind of important. And my hope is, so to share some of my experiences, but also to encourage anybody who isn't registered to be an organ donor to seriously consider registering to be an organ donor. And you know, you may think I'm a good or bad example of why you should do that. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about my path to getting to my career trajectory, because Mandana insisted that I do that, but Tanya actually did more than I was planning to. I only want to say a few things about that. One, I feel incredibly fortunate, and there have been really a couple of formative experiences during my career trajectory. One is just being able to work with really great people, both while I was training, and I'm still training, but here at MIT and at sort of every step of my career. Two was actually working with Tanya. She was an undergraduate, as she said, and that was quite an experience. And the key word of caution there, you know, Tanya became department head before I did. So be really, really careful about how you treat the undergrads you work with, because one day they could be your boss. Okay, so that's, I didn't know that at the time. I wish I did. And really, you know, for me, a transformative event obviously was my heart transplant, and that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and then I'm just going to open it up to questions and really let you guys steer where the discussion goes. Okay, so there's a lot of people right now in this country waiting for transplant. There are over 30,000 transplants in this country in 2015. This many heart transplants, almost 3,000, but there's over 120,000 people on a waiting list. And there's two ways to come off of any transplant waiting list, really. One is with a transplant, so that was me, I was kind of lucky, and the other is without a transplant. And if you come off a waiting list without a transplant, the vast majority of people don't survive. Okay, so, and the issue is there aren't enough organs to transplant all the people who are on waiting lists. So I was incredibly lucky. I actually was on a transplant waiting list for about 1.5 years. I knew for about a year or so before that I would need a transplant, but I wasn't listed until about 1.5 years before the actual surgery. And I had a very rare heart disease called cardiac sarcoidosis. I knew absolutely nothing about this disease. I learned way more than I ever wanted to. and some of it I still remember. This is actually just to explain it. It's a rare inflammatory disease. It can affect almost any organ. And it's really a sort of hyperactive immune response that's targeted to one or more organs in your body. In this country, the most common targets are lungs and lymph nodes, also skin to some extent, and much less frequent in this country are other organs. There are two sort of, so when I found out that this is what I had, I sort of, did lots of literature searches and read as much as I could, and there are really only two things that can happen. The disease somehow stops for some unknown magic reason, or it progresses. And if it progresses, depending on what organ it's affecting, that's not too good. So what happened to me was the day Tanya mentioned was July 3rd, 2002. I woke up one morning not feeling too great. It was like 95 degrees out at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it's like, oh, I don't feel so great because it's so hot out. Got dressed, came to work, and as Tanya said, I walked from the parking lot, which was right about where this building is, to building 68, and I almost passed out. So, being an MIT faculty member, I decided to go up to my lab. I took the elevator, I checked my email, just got to do the important things, and I really wasn't feeling too well. So I decided I would go over to health services. So I went downstairs and walked across the street to health services, almost passed out again, and within a relatively short period of time, they sent me by ambulance to Mass General. They had no idea what was going on, what was wrong, other than I had this thing called heart block, and heart block is basically the electrical system in your heart doesn't work. So my heart rate was really, really low for me, and it's just beating spontaneously in my case, it was a rate of about 30 to 40 beats per minute. And so that was not too good. Normal for most people is around 60 or 70. So at that point, they decided I needed a pacemaker. They gave me a pacemaker. Actually, if anybody wants to see a pacemaker, I actually brought it with me because when they took it out, I asked them to save it, and so I'm happy to pass this around. It's in a little biohazard bag. It's 14 years old. I don't think it's a biohazard anymore, but this thing was stuck in my chest right here, and there were wires running to my heart that just sent electrical signals that made my heart beat. I'm happy to pass that. So that was, and then I was okay. I felt good. I, could do stuff. I was playing softball. That summer sort of my career ended, but I started again the next year. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong. They did all kinds of tests, nothing, and they decided they would monitor my heart function every 3 months with an echocardiogram, so to measure the ability of the heart to pump. And what they found was my heart just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and the ability of it to pump kept decreasing, and they didn't know why. And then at one point, during one of these echocardiograms, they discovered a blood clot in the tip of my heart, which is very common if your heart doesn't work so well. And then I was in congestive heart failure, which means your heart doesn't work well enough to support normal activities. So I was retaining fluid, my lungs would fill with fluid, and at that point I went on a virtually sodium-free diet, or as sodium-free as one could possibly be. So I was eating less than half a teaspoon of salt a day. So one of my favorite foods is pizza with jalapenos, as some of you might know. I couldn't eat pizza unless I made it myself without sodium, and I couldn't eat anything else I couldn't go out to restaurants, I couldn't buy prepared foods. So that's when I started really doing all of my own cooking. And being on a really low sodium diet and not drinking any fluids, I was actually able to be somewhat functional and not be not get congested constantly. In March of 2004, they did a biopsy of my heart, and that's when I was diagnosed with this disease called sarcoidosis. And at that point, I started having lots of arrhythmias that they were really worried about, so they took that thing out that's going around, the pacemaker, and they put in another pacemaker that is also a defibrillator. And defibrillators there's one around here somewhere. If your heart stops or you get into a really weird rhythm, it shocks you. So this thing was built into my chest, and it actually saved my life twice. Once I didn't know because I was asleep, or I thought I was asleep, I was unconscious. And the other time I was awake and I knew what was going on. It's the scariest thing that ever happened to me was this thing firing. And when I asked them, so they interrogated to make sure it still works every once in a while, and they said, "Oh, this thing fired." And I said, "No, I didn't feel anything." And they said, "Well, you would have felt it." And I asked them, "What does it feel like?" And they said, "It feels like getting kicked in the chest by a horse." And so you would have felt it. And so I didn't, which means I was unconscious. But I couldn't figure out how they knew what it felt like to get kicked in the chest by a horse. Actually, that's what it feels like. So when I was conscious and it fired a second time, this was a year after the first time, I heard this loud thunder and a big flash of light and real searing pain that didn't last long, but it would just, and I knew what happened. Then I went to the hospital. Okay. So I was in this tachycardia, this bad heart rhythm, almost daily for well over a year, but not at a high enough rate to trigger the defibrillator to fire. So I was able to live with that. And that was, in some ways, a blessing that it wasn't at a real high rate. In December of '04, I was put on a transplant waiting list. And then May 4th, they started the surgery, and I'm told they finished it May 5th. I actually don't remember any of that. And I was home 3 weeks later. And then in August, September, so several months after that, I came back to work full time. With a HEPA. So there's a HEPA filter in my office, there's a HEPA filter in our bedroom, there's a HEPA filter in our basement, there's a HEPA filter in my son's room, and quite honestly, I don't think we need any of it. But it's an air filter. It's just it filters out particles and microbes. So I'll talk about why that might be relevant. So lots of effects on family. My son, when this all started happening, was 3 years old. When in 2002, in 2006, he was, I don't know, eight, almost 9 in first grade. So this had a big effect on him. We were very open with him about what was going on, and he knew every step of the way what was happening. And right now, I'm incredibly fortunate. I'm fortunate to be alive. I work full time, sometimes a little more. I'm active with my family. We travel, we do stuff together. And I exercise. And despite what Tanya said, I don't exercise, and I don't really play tennis twice a week. I think about playing tennis twice a week, but I do play at least once a week. And the other thing, one of the things that was really took me a while to get used to is my heart rate doesn't change. So when they do a transplant, they cut all the nerves. So there's no nerve connections to your heart. So when you get nervous, like when you give these talks, my heart rate doesn't go up. So I would be really good at passing a lie detector test, but I'm not so good when it comes to sudden bursts of activity and doing exercise. So if I start running really, well, I never run very fast, but if I try to run really fast, I will get lightheaded and pass out. And that happened a few times in the first year, and I really didn't know what was going on. Plus, I was dehydrated because I was still on a low-salt, low-fluid diet, which I sort of just didn't think about changing until one of my doctors said, "You should have a pickle for lunch every day." And well, I didn't really do that, but I started eating more salt. The other sort of big deal is I'm on immunosuppression, and that's absolutely essential for any transplant recipient to survive. And I'll be on immunosuppression forever. So that's the reason for the air filters, to take out any particles or possible infectious agents. And so immunosuppressive drugs are really good. They enable people to survive. In fact, all of the improvements in transplantation care and survival rates are due to the immunosuppression and dealing with the effects of that, and not due to the surgery. The surgery, I'm told, is much easier than a bypass or a valve replacement. Those are more complicated. A transplant is, it's like plumbing. You just take the thing out and you stick in another, and it's not that, I'm told, it's not that complicated. But immunosuppression also does some other things, so that aren't so great. I mean, it lets me live. That's good, I think. There's increased risk of infection, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of diabetes. There's anybody on immunosuppression develops high blood pressure, decreased renal function. There's possible coronary artery disease and lots of other stuff. So none of this is that big a deal. It's all manageable. You monitor it and you sort of take care of it. And I've been incredibly lucky not having to deal with any of these in any sort of acute way. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about transplantation in general, and this is kind of my pitch to think about being an organ donor if you're not. People who donate organs give someone else or several other people a chance to live. And in my case, I don't know who the donor was, but whoever it was, basically something tragic happened to that person that enabled me to actually be here today. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. And when I've met donor families of people who have been donors, they are incredibly grateful and comforted by the notion that something good had come out of something tragic that they had experienced. If you're planning to be a donor, the most important thing is to tell your family about it. Make sure your wishes are known so that if something tragic does happen to you, people who are close to you know what your intent was. And talk about sort of why you want to do that. And it's really the opportunity to give somebody else or several other people a chance to survive. Okay. So again, I just want to emphasize, discuss with your family that it's important that they know your wishes, and consider registering to be a donor. And there are lots of ways to do that. The easiest today is you can do it when you renew your driver's license. That was rolled out several years ago in Massachusetts. I was actually at the press conference that announced that. It was kind of fun. And there's lots of websites that you can just log on to, and now there's big buttons where you can register. So I think I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to answer or at least entertain any questions about any or all of this. Amanda.
So can you say a little bit about how you continued your scientific life during these 4 years?
Yeah, my scientific life during those 4 years. So I was coming to work and was fairly functional until about September or October of 2004. And at that point, I was acutely sick and couldn't come to work. We were having lab meetings at my house. The lab would come once a week. Some people would stay, and I would talk to them about their work. And at one point when I was in the hospital, someone in my lab needed to give a talk, and everybody in my lab knows if they're going to give a talk somewhere, they have to do a practice talk. So a grad student came to the hospital and did a practice talk one evening, and it actually turned out to be really great because I had a roommate, and after the student left from giving the practice talk, the roommate called the nurse and asked to switch rooms. So I ended up without a roommate. So I'm thinking, I should do this every time I get a roommate. So I tried. We published 2 papers during that time, which I'm very proud of, actually, because That was done entirely by the lab and with me just doing a little bit while at home or in the hospital. At one point during this, from December to 2004 to May, I was in the hospital for about 5.5 months straight. So they gave me a high-speed internet. The Wi-Fi wasn't so good, so they gave me Ethernet. I had a refrigerator. And Mike Laub, I don't know if he's here, he was hired during this time. And he actually came to visit me in the hospital, and we talked about, I tried to recruit him to the department. And so I don't know if that worked, but it didn't scare him away. So I tried to maintain some semblance of research and do what I could. But as Tanya said, when I came back, there was all this stuff that people were doing that I just had I don't remember what it was, but I didn't know what it was. And I had to learn all these new techniques, and that was a real eye-opener.
It used to be, I heard some years ago that a complication of heart transplants was an increased rate of arteriosclerosis.
Yes.
Is that still the
Yes,
case?
and it's largely thought, so increased arteriosclerosis with heart transplants, it's largely thought to be low levels of rejection that affect the blood vessels. And so not a full-blown rejection, but just low levels of rejection that then cause plaque buildup. And that's still the case. So, they want me to do, so right after the transplant, they monitor for rejection, and I was having biopsies every 2 weeks, heart biopsies every 2 weeks, and then once a month, and then every couple months, and then every 6 months. Now, not at all. But at the same time, they do an angiogram to check your arteries. And my arteries are crystal clear, and I'm more afraid of invasive procedures than I am of developing arteriosclerosis. So I'm trying not to do any more angiograms.
Say something about your diet, and I think Tanya mentioned you do a lot of your own cooking.
Yes.
Is it really affected a lot by these various?
Yes, so now my diet is, I can eat almost whatever I want. So actually the easiest way to describe my diet is I pretend I'm pregnant. So, I don't eat raw cheese, I don't eat uncooked meat or fish, and I don't eat things I'm allergic to. That's always been the case. So I can eat as much salt as I want, I can drink as much as I want, liquids, not alcohol. I can drink alcohol, I don't overdo it, I never did, I still don't, but wine with dinner whenever I want is fine. So now there's really very little restrictions on my diet, other than trying to avoid things that have high probability of causing infection. When I was sick, being on a low sodium diet was really, really important. And any time that I strayed from that, my lungs would fill with fluid and I would be congested and really sick for a week or two before that would resolve. So that's when I started doing all my own cooking and learned how to make pizza with no salt. I read cookbooks. I have several, half a dozen Indian cookbooks. I love Indian food. I learned how to cook Indian food with no salt.
Become a vegetarian?
No.
Are you on the same level of immunosuppressants? Or?
No. So they start at a really, really high level. And the first several months, the first week, I was on mega doses of immunosuppression and steroids. I was like, I couldn't sleep. I was hallucinating. The first week, what I remember is the stories people tell me. I don't remember very little from that first week after. I was in a lot of pain, and that is because they broke a rib when they did the surgery, and they didn't know that, and they didn't tell me. So they're saying, oh, you should feel much better. And it's like, this really hurts. And then, I don't know, 6 months or a year later, they did some x-ray, and they said, oh, you had a broken rib. I said, I've never had a broken rib in my life. And the x-rays they took right before the transplant, there was no broken rib. So that's why I was in a lot of pain. So now, so then they taper down the immunosuppression, and now I'm on a relatively modest amount, and certainly the steroids. So the steroids were tapered slowly over time. The first, when I came back to work in August, September, I had 2 grants that were up for renewal. Okay, so the timing was really good because both of my grants were renewed right before I got sick, and then I shrunk the lab. So the lab was down to, I think, 3 people. And so I extended the grants for a year each, and then they were up for renewal. But I was on, I don't recommend you do this, but I was on really high levels of steroids. I was just wired. I wrote 2 grants in a really short amount of time. And yeah.
So you don't have any problem with fluid buildup?
No, none at all.
So after this life-changing experience in many ways, I'd like your thoughts about taking the department leadership. It was something that I didn't expect, but you've been so generous in doing it. So talk about it.
So for me, community, and the way I was brought up, my parents, my family, community is really important. And treating people respectfully is really important. And I didn't want to be department head. And I think anybody who does want to be department head is usually disqualified from becoming department head. So I should have said I really want to do it, and then I would have been off the list. And my wife was initially very concerned about me becoming department head, just in terms of the amount of extra work, the stress. I usually don't get too stressed about stuff. I'm pretty intense, as some of you may know, and I'm way less intense than I used to be, but I don't stress about too many things. So when I was asked to be department head, it was important to me to sort of understand what the job entailed. It was important for me to think about contributing, giving back to the community, from which I've benefited tremendously. And to think about, from a health perspective, would I be able to handle it? And the answer, I think, I talked to my doctors. They said, there's no problem. I mean, health-wise, you can do whatever you want. They were concerned, is it going to be stressful? Little parts are stressful, but no more stressful for me anyway than like dealing with my son. One of the things I realized, after my transplant, I became much more patient about certain things and much less patient about other things. And some of the things I was less patient about, I've had to sort of like I was less patient with my son, who would whine about stuff sometimes. It's like, stop whining, it's not a big deal. But it actually is. And so it took me a little while to adjust to that. And I think that was important also for me to be able to serve as department head or associate head and do the kinds of things. The other thing I want to say, I think, about administrative stuff is, one of the things that came out of this whole thing was I thought a lot about, like, did I want to come back to work? Did I want to retire? Because I really seriously thought about retiring. There are 2 times when I thought about seriously about leaving science. Once was in grad school, where almost everybody who I know, 90% or more in grad school go through some period of time where, do I really want to be doing this? Am I good enough to do this? Do I want to do it? Do I like it enough to do it, right? So I went through that in grad school. It's usually the 2nd or 3rd year. That's about when it was for me. And then when I was sick, it's like, if I survive, do I want to come back to work? And I could do lots of things if I didn't. And my wife works. She makes more money than I do. I don't have to work. It's like, that's good. It's like, okay. But I decided this is what I wanted to do. I really like doing it, doing science and working with people here. And so but I also thought a lot about graduate training. That's what I was involved in a lot. And I realized that there are lots of people on campus who do microbial science and engineering, and being sick and thinking about this stuff in the hospital sort of nucleated the notion of starting a microbiology graduate program. And I don't think that would have happened had I not gone through this.
What are the considerations involved in getting on the list for a transplant, both on your side and on the list side?
So what are the considerations for being on a transplant list? So there's, basically, you won't survive unless you have a transplant. Then you get listed. And that's their criteria. And then the sort of priority is the most sick people rise to the top, and the longer you're on the list, the higher up you go. So, and then they have, I don't know exactly what it is today, but back then, there were very specific criteria for whether you were sick enough or not. And that usually involved what kind of medications you were taking. And the key medication that you needed to be on to be listed in the sort of high priority was something that causes a lot of arrhythmia. And I had constant arrhythmia, so they couldn't give it to me. So I could never go to the sort of highest priority. And then finally, so the way that if you go into this tachycardia, the way they treat it is they give you lidocaine, IV. So lidocaine is what you get shots for when you get, you know, a filling or something. And it numbs the nerves in your body. So if you take it IV, it's like it numbs your brain. So I couldn't think, I couldn't remember anything. And so what they ended up doing was right at the last month or so, they put me on constant low dose of lidocaine and then petitioned to be a high priority on the waiting list. And that's what actually got me. And then I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks before I got a transplant.
So, this is wonderful, but what's the prognosis for you?
Oh, it's 10 years, you know. Whatever I can get. I'm not going to die from my heart disease. I'm going to die from one of these other things that I listed. Cancer, or I'll get hit by a truck, or, you know, an infection. I'm probably going to die from some kind of lung infection.
So having a heart transplant doesn't shorten the life of the heart?
No, it does not shorten the life of the heart. In fact, most people who are transplanted die from some complication from the immunosuppression. Yeah.
What are the age limitations on being a donor?
None. None.
So they'll take it from heart from anybody?
Yeah. Well, there's no age limitation on being a donor. There are certainly considerations. They would not have given me a 90-year-old heart. They would not. And they do a lot of screening. They do a little bit of matching. Most of the matching is done by size. So the heart has to fit, and it has to be big enough to support whatever body it's put in. There's a couple of matching antigens that if you have antibodies for, you're guaranteed, if the heart presents those against those antibodies, there's guaranteed rejection. So they screen those out. So that's actually why I got my heart, is that there was a person ahead of me on the waiting list, and they had antibodies to some common antigen, and they couldn't receive the heart. So, you know, if you have cancer, you can't be a donor. If you have HIV, it used to be that you can't be a donor. I don't know if that's still the case. And what they do if they're, so they try to do a little bit of age matching, but not a lot.
What's the rationale for cancer?
I don't know. No, go ahead.
How much time did you have once you found out that the heart was available?
Oh. They came in one morning and they said, "Don't eat." And I said, "What? I like to eat." They said, "Don't eat. You may be transplanted today." So they said, you're sort of second. They always prepare 2 people. So if there's going to be a transplant, there's always 2 people prepared, the first person and the second person. They said, you're the second person, so you're going to get prepared, and we don't know yet whether you'll get the heart or not. And then several hours later, they came back and said, it's yours. So I called my parents, who lived outside of New Haven in a town called Brantford, which is where I grew up. They drove up. My wife picked my son up from school at the end of the day. They came up to the house. We had a little party. I couldn't eat. Everybody else could eat. I couldn't eat. And you know, it was just great. I was really, really happy. And then they carted me off. I don't know what time it was, but early evening. Rudolph.
So this is the question of the heart rate. So I assume your heart rate is fixed by a pacemaker.
No, I don't have a pacemaker now.
So
I do not have, so my heart, anybody's heart beats on its own. So when they do the transplant, they somehow jumpstart the heart. And the heart that I have in me right now would beat constantly at about 90 to 100 beats per minute on its own. And that's too high, so you know, everybody who with a transplant takes medication to decrease blood pressure and heart rate. So my heart rate runs at about 70. And if I start exercising in about 10 minutes, it'll go up to 90, and I don't think it's ever gone higher. But I don't have any hardware. There's no, you know, I can go through the airport now without worrying about anything, which I couldn't do with that thing that's going around.
So Alan, there was a news item recently that the top few which they have done
4, yeah, I read that, yeah.
So hospitals do have manpower, some hospitals.
So at Mass General, I know there were 4 surgeons, and somebody is always on call. Tufts, from what I understood, that was a real stretch. They had the manpower to do that, they had the surgeons to do that, but it was a real stretch.
What are the guidelines about knowing the situation of the donor, or knowing who the donor was, or the donor's families?
Not supposed to know anything about the donor. I don't know how long, a few months after the transplant, I actually wrote, you can write to the donor family anonymously, and you send your letter to the New England Organ Bank, and then they know who the donor is. They will forward it to the donor family. So I did that a few months after the transplant, and I never heard anything back. And I'm told that you hear back about half the time, and then you can meet if there's interest, and half the time you don't hear anything back. I probably should write again, but I'll blame it on being department head. Yeah, you can draft a letter for me. A good idea, yeah.
Can you speak briefly just about like a quick summary of what the recovery was like from like in the hospital to like what it was like when you first got home?
Yeah, so what was the recovery like? So I was in a lot of pain, and unbeknownst to me, because of a broken rib. They sent me home in a little bit less than 3 weeks, and the criteria for that is if you can walk up and down a flight of stairs, you're out of here, or out of there. So yeah, I walked up and down a flight of stairs, and they said, okay, you can go home. At home, what do I remember? I was in pain from the broken rib, I think, for a little while. But you know, I was able to walk around. I started eating regular food, and it was just sort of slowly getting strength back. And really the most important thing, I think, was I was on such high levels of immunosuppression that the advice was to avoid a lot of contact. Don't ride in the subway for a few months. You know, try to stay not completely isolated, but you know, don't expose yourself to unnecessary risks with such high levels of immunosuppression. And really, I don't remember much else. I don't think it was too remarkable, other than, you know, sort of starting to get back into the normal swing of things. What personally was hard was I was starting to do things that I hadn't done in several years. So I was really, you know, walking down a flight of stairs, I would get nervous because I might pass out, right? So it took a while for me to get over this uncertainty about what was I going to be able to do. I didn't start playing tennis until, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And it just, so my son was playing tennis, and I was watching him, and it was like, I used to play tennis all the time. And so maybe I should start again. And so was like, let's give it a try. Actually, there's only once when I passed out on the tennis court. That was 2 years ago. But, you know, so it just, I think psychologically it took me several years to get to the point where I felt comfortable doing normal things. I don't have to push myself anymore to do normal things.
Some decades ago, there seemed to be momentum building for artificial hearts.
Yes.
And did that just fail, or was it overtaken by the immunosuppression and the fact that this works?
I think there's still a lot of, not as much, but still some push for artificial hearts. It's largely been overtaken by these things called LVADs, left ventricular assist devices, which are pumps that they can implant that basically mimic heart function. And years ago, if you were on one of these, it was like you could be on it for a few months and you had to be in the hospital, and there was this big machine that you were attached to that helped it pump. And now they're using it for people for several years. And they put a little power pack that you can carry around, and you have a pump that. So I think that has enabled people to survive longer pre-transplant with heart failure. And there's a lot of emphasis now on trying to grow artificial organs, or some with an artificial heart, but not as much as there had been.
So I imagine it must have been hard to stay sort of positive during this time. Can you talk a little bit about your mindset?
Yeah, actually, it was not hard to stay positive for me. And I think this gets back to my family and my parents and their approach to life. And like I would say 1 day a month, I would just shut down and not want to interact or talk to anybody. But otherwise, my approach was like, this sucks. Let's just make the most of it. There's still good things that can happen. There's still, I can still have a sense of humor. I can still laugh. I can still, my family came up to the hospital. My wife came up every single day when I was in the hospital. My son came up with her 4 times a week. We'd have dinner together. He loved it because he got to watch TV, which he didn't get to watch at home. He liked the pizza at the hospital. He would say on the way in, I can smell the pizza on Starro Drive. It's like, oh yeah. So no, my attitude, I did not get depressed. And it was like, I'm just going to make the best of this situation. I don't wish it on anybody, but there are really good things that came out of it. My parents and my parents came up to visit every other weekend or every third weekend, and they got to know my in-laws really well who lived here. My son got to know his grandparents really well. That wouldn't have happened had I not been sick. Now, getting sick isn't a good reason to make those things happen, but there were and are good things that came out of that, and that's what I was able to focus on. So that really helped me tremendously. And I go to hospitals and talk to people who are on transplant waiting lists. When I was waiting, people came who had been through it, and you could see there is a possible good outcome. So I meet people who are really depressed, and I don't know how they get through it. But I was like, I don't have any control over it. I'm just going to worry about things I can control, like what am I going to eat for breakfast.
With the immunosuppression, do you have to take any special considerations in working in a building that has a lot of BL2 level areas?
Yeah, so not so much in the building, but in my lab, there are certain organisms that we won't work with. Listeria monocytogenes, we can't work with in the lab anymore. Other kinds of listeria are okay, but so again, pretending I'm pregnant and avoiding things that pregnant women try to avoid. Listeria is a big one.
You've had a couple health scares in the last 10 years, and I think one of them was due to an unknown drug interaction or something. Want to say anything about like that and how you've, I know you've taken some effort to educate the doctors and nurses.
So one of the things I would encourage anybody to do who has to interact with the healthcare system is learn as much as you can and be a strong advocate for yourself. So when they discovered this blood clot in my heart, I was put on anticoagulants, Coumadin, very common. And I was sort of, you get tested to see how much you need and whether you have too much or too little. And I was able to adjust at home how much I was taking. I sort of, after a while, figured out if I ate a lot of salad and a lot of greens, I should take a little more. And if I didn't eat a lot of stuff, I should take a little less. And I could adjust this. You get into the hospital and they test it and they say, oh, you're a little low. And they look at some chart and they say, okay, we're going to give you this much. And I would say, well, that much is too much. We're going to overshoot. Nope, this is, so I got into these arguments because I'm not too shy with these doctors who, this is what you got to do. It's like, no, that's too much. So finally I said, okay, we'll do whatever you say. Totally overshoot. We do this twice. The doctor comes back and says, okay, do what you want. So they don't know me, some of the ones who aren't my real doctors, they don't know me from a hole in the wall. So, they just go by the book, and the book doesn't work for everybody, especially with different kinds of medication. So some of the blood pressure medication I was on was causing problems, so we had to adjust that. Early on, there was, if you have any latent viruses, if you're on immunosuppression, sometimes those viruses become reactivated. So I had a CMV issue, and my white count went way down, and I had to deal with that. But so little things like that. The other sort of thing that's recurrent is, I get tested for skin cancer 2 or 3 times a year, and lots of basal cell carcinomas and those aren't a big deal. I mean, as long as you catch them and take care of them, they're not a big deal.
And you were a redhead, so you were...
Oh, I was susceptible anyway, and then the
immunosuppression
heightens that. Yeah. No. So, when I was figured out, when they told me what the diagnosis was, I did all these literature searches, like, what are the treatments, right? And there's all this anecdotal crap in the literature about, we had 6 patients and we treated 3 of them with immunosuppression and 3 of them with nothing, and, 2 of the 3 died and 1 of the other, so they think maybe they tried immunosuppression. I was immunosuppressed heavily during that time. It did absolutely nothing to stop progression. So it's immune related for sure. There's absolutely, yeah. It's inflammatory response, granulomas, and that's what causes the heart disease.
Is there a gene for that?
Yeah, so there have been some studies, and I was following the literature for a little while. I stopped several years ago. There was one report that I remember of possibly a linkage to some splicing factor that affected production of some antibody that maybe was correlated, but not very good.
So they still don't know.
They don't know, and
they wouldn't find it.
No. And the sarcoidosis is lumped for all these different organs. It's not clear that the cause is the same for every case. So it really is not known.
Am I right in saying that there was about 12 people in the world that had it in the heart when you did?
No, there's more than that. Yeah, I don't remember the numbers. I looked them up. It's actually, in terms of sarcoidosis, it's the most common in Japan is the heart, is cardiac. In this country, I used to know the numbers. I don't remember. 1 in 10 of the 5th. So I don't remember.
So small.
Small. Okay, thank you.